Hi, just a quick aside before I start this one. This video isn't going to have much of a visual component. There's a lot of reading to do in this one page, and it comes in the form of a mock walkthrough page. So it's really just going to be a couple of images to cover the text and not much else. If you want, you could just skip this video. Just skim over the text if it doesn't matter to you. It functions more as a recap than anything else. I've also left a link to the HOMESTUCK page where this came from if you'd like to read it over there. That said, let's get to it. An examination of the basics. Upon connecting with the client user, you, the server user, will be met with a control panel allowing you to manipulate your co-player's environment. You will find that you are allowed to deploy 4 items at no expense. 3 of these are rather large machines, and 1 is a punch card. It's quite possible that you will already have deployed some of these items before reading this. If this is the case, and you have activated the machine called the Cruxtruder such that it displays a countdown, you must proceed to section A100 of this walkthrough immediately. The life of the client user depends on it, and if your co-player has activated this device in your environment too, then yours does as well. But if not, please refrain from doing anything with the Cruxtruder aside from merely deploying it. This will buy us some time to think things through properly and go over the basics of the game before you find your soft, easily punctured head in the jaws of the lion. As mentioned, there are 4 items to consider, each playing a role in a process which appears to have a singular purpose: to manufacture objects out of thin air. The designers of this game, judging by the language used, regard this process as a sort of alchemy. This may allude to complexities in the production process yet to present themselves, but for now, the variety of objects you are able to create remains quite limited. The items in question are the Cruxtruder. Again, tread lightly with this one, the Totem, the Alkymeter, and the pre-punched card. I will describe how these devices work in conjunction with each other, and I will use the analogy of having a key made at a hardware store to help you understand. First, deploy all of these blocks in convenient proximity to each other. Be sure not to block doors or pathways with them. You can always revise the dimensions of rooms to make space for them, but I'd advise against this or any experimenting with the function. Doing so comes at the cost of Bildgeist, a commodity which appears to be a premium at the onset, and one you'd be best advised to save for later. The Cruxtruder. Removing the lid signals the moment your life becomes a great whirling batshit pandemonium, somewhat resembling the chaos of an especially ethnic wedding. Somewhere a sauced uncle deliberately shatters china on the floor. Muddy livestock is decorated and then lost track of. The question, whose mule is this, at times can be heard over the din. This is now your reality. But aside from that, it marks the beginning of the process I'm about to describe. The countdown begins, yes. Also an entity called the kernel sprite is released. But neither of these things are all that relevant to this process, to my knowledge. More on these things later. What is relevant is the unlidded Cruxtruder's ability to dispense Cruxite dowels. It will dispense at least 1, although I suspect it is capable of producing more, given parameters I am not yet familiar with. In my key-making analogy, these dowels represent the uncarved pieces of metal on which the hardware store employee retrieves from a drawer or a rack and sets about carving into a key. The 2 following items are needed to do the carving. The pre-punched card. This is a simple Silodex card containing an item. There is evidence to suggest the specific item it contains is variable from session to session. The card I deployed contained a blue apple. Yours may be different. It shouldn't matter, hopefully. Additionally, the card you may guess is punched, like one used with antique computing systems. The pattern of holes comprises data, which I believe corresponds to the instructions for creating the item the card contains. That it is pre-punched suggests there is a way to punch an unpunched card, possibly imprinting it with the data for the item it contains, though no mechanism for this has presented itself yet. But the data on the card cannot be used to create the item directly. there is a middleman. That middleman is the totem lathe. The totem lathe. This is essentially the key carving machine. It will carve into your Crooksite dowel a pattern of grooves and contours, the sort which makes a key unique. The instructions for this pattern are supplied by the punch card, which is inserted into the lathe pre-activation to configure its chisels. Once the dowel is carved, you have a totem serving as your key, which can then be used to unlock the card item through the Alkymeter. But at this point, I will diverge from my key-making analogy and switch to a barcode analogy, which is not a terribly strenuous leap to make, since the concepts of a key and a barcode are essentially the same, one being a unique pattern of grooves, the other of varying black lines. The Alkymeter. If you place a Crooksite dowel, carved or uncarved, on the Alkymeter's small pedestal, its robotic arm will scan the contours with a laser, hence the barcode analogy. This is the machine's way of reading the data originally imprinted from the card, and transforming that data into a physical object. Though typically this is not done without expense, I believe. An uncarved dowel results in the creation of a perfectly generic object, which is a seemingly useless green cube. It costs 2 units of Buildgeist to make, and I do not advise you to waste resources on it. There appears to be many other varieties of Geist, ostensibly used in combinations to create different sorts of items, which possibly offers some insight into the game's use of the term alchemy. But quite conveniently, there is an exception to this. Creating the item on the pre-punched card costs nothing. This is good, because creating this item turns out to be essential. Now that you know this, you can in your own time begin the process. Once you initiate it, naturally there is no going back, so best to be prepared. But you probably shouldn't drag your feet too long. As I mentioned earlier, this is your only means of escape. When you're ready, be prepared to follow the steps in the next section swiftly.